So this is the political compass. You all know it, you all love it. It tells you so many things about yourself in a neat and tidy package. It's objective, standardized, and doesn't leave room for misinterpretation. But what if I told you that this chart was actually one giant lie? At the most basic premise it was outlining to you was a type of fiction. Well, I think that this is the case, and I'm going to explain why. Apart from that, I'm going to bring focus to a system with the same premise as this one that does, I believe, rectify the chart's previous issues. The problem with the political compass meme is that it's been blown out of proportion from what it actually represents. People have created gross stereotypes that don't accurately represent their own politics, let alone others. Now, I'm not necessarily one to peddle conspiracies, but to me this old design has a variety of things which to me speak to a specific worldview of the author, and really it's more like a system of ethical thinking than politics, actually. I think this for two reasons. One being that I have a historical backing for this, and two being that politics is actually a lot more cut and dry than it appears to be, as I will be attempting to demonstrate. Now, just because this is a video about the political compass doesn't mean I want this to seem like a heavily politicized video. I'm not about so much pushing a particular agenda as much as merely giving a free rein for developing thought. I imagine a lot of people are somewhat attached to the notions outlined in this old system, but I propose that the discourse has grown stale around it, and it could help to just shake things up a bit here. If you want to change the world, you need to have a clear picture of it, and even if you really like the old compass, this one could offer some original ideas to you. So the first thing you notice is that I've taken the compass and I've rotated it somewhat. This creates a clean divide down the middle, which separates the left and right with equal components of a mode of highly centralized and rigid authority at the top and a very loose form of government, which is not as tightly wound at the bottom. I have some specific reasons for doing this, but let me try to explain the basic concepts of the axes. They're still basically the same. In fact, in spite of my clarifications for new phrasings, it really is the same compass with a slant. One thing I feel the original compass failed to do properly, though, is explain what really is the difference between top and bottom, because it's not actually a lack of government. There's no such thing as politics without government, truly. There's always a government because, well, people make rules. That's how society goes. Now, see, the primary difference here is simply that one form of politics comes from a preordained authority, while the bottom is much more fluid in its dynamics and can shift in accordance with what just about anyone thinks or feels, really. There are indeed advantages to both. One failure of the top model would be when in China's development, they had a very unorganized hierarchy, which led to bad communication, where grain was not distributed properly, which did indeed lead to mass starvation. But on the other hand, without any predetermination, there's chaos, and in my opinion, you need some level of balance between chaos and order to best clarify the needs of the people and also meet them efficiently. Which China could have very well done if their system had clear lines of communication, but I digress. So let's talk about the thing that most people think is important, and that's the left and right. Let me just clarify one thing, though, that this will be explained in more detail later. The left does not mean liberals. The right does not mean conservatives. To quickly explain that, liberal and conservative are both constructs of the current socio-political sphere and do not necessarily have their grounding in anything on this chart. Hell, there are some days I honestly think conservatives are more leftist than liberals allegedly are. So yeah, what do these crazy left and right ideas mean? Nobody really knows. Anyway, I'm going to keep talking about politics generally and explain that later. Politics are inherently divisive. It's almost impossible to bring them up today without also creating some kind of mental boundary, either separating you from those you disagree with or tying you into an allegiance with people who you do agree with. I would say even that people don't even know how to talk politics without having this mindset of tribalism. That's what American politics are, after all, an act of conforming others to suit the larger agenda of a hive mind mentality. And let me tell you something about politics. No matter how tame they are on the surface, all politics are, in a very literal sense, a form of waged warfare, mental warfare, but regardless. Polarized factions do not want to compromise, and they are also not interested in having a civil discourse. I mean this in the sense that we are culturally fractured to a point where reconciliation is not even something that's given a small degree of consideration. Every time you see some new thing in the news crop up, the left and right fly in with their presumptive ideological blinders and begin classifying everything in accordance with the divine scriptures of their party, promising great things of their own thoughts and condemning the other side as objectively evil in any and every respect. The thing about this is it's society of the spectacle. You don't quite realize this, but with some reflection, you may come to the conclusion I have of these divided factions. Neither side is actually trying to do everything in order to elevate society's state towards some net good. Maybe in their minds they are self-assured that they are doing just that, but the truth is that in order to fit society towards its most optimized state, you have to not just give opinions or even be right, but rather you have to be able to have insight into what truly can be done. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So I do absolutely believe that society needs to move more left, but I do want to do so not with a kind of disregard to whatever you happen to believe. I'm actually interested in expanding the discourse, and you can call me biased, but I do think my political compass system offers a lot more clarity. It's utterly simple in its concepts and doesn't refrain into any of the modernized political dogma. I think for those with less prior investments in the chaotic realm of online politics, that this video will break down the basic systems with which politics operates under. It's sometimes hard to not get lost in all the upheaval online, and part of the actual reason for this is due to the compass itself. And you have to realize the problem that's essential to modern politics is in fact due to the premise that we can create a socially constructed notion of what the left and right represent, when really they're quite concrete. I'm going to be making a video later explaining what is the social aspect of politics, which is clearly distinct from the concepts I'm trying to outline here. In fact, I made an entire other chart for it, but anyway, let's get into it. I realistically view the left-right divide through a kind of perennial lens, that there are times when the group is most important, there are times when the individual is most important. Groups are definitely not infallible, and individuals sometimes have to trailblaze progress. Of course, we are all ultimately stronger if we cooperate to achieve goals. So I'm going to give the fastest, most efficient definition of left and right possible here. The further left you are, the more you want to leverage other people's well-being to improve the world. This could mean pooling resources and concentrated group efforts which make everyone's life better through collaboration. The further right you are, the more you value your own individual authority in the world. It's not necessarily wrong. I don't think, for instance, money is the root of all evil, but the problem with elitist beliefs is that the individual begins to assume that he is more important than the group, which is objectively false. Still, you need individuals who are capable of, realizing whatever their own vision is. So that's simple enough. Good. Now, again, let me take a minute and zoom out from the topic. I don't want to delve too far into this without really explaining why I took an interest in it in the first place. See, I took an interest in politics specifically because I wanted to figure out how to make the world the most effective system for as many people possible. But most people, I feel, get into politics because they want to stand for something that represents the overall desires of their peer group. But they don't actually want to go beyond that to where these politics can both come into fruition in the real world, and also not where they can, apart from merely believing in things, also understand why they believe said things. I've always just kind of known deep down the mechanisms of the current system are not geared towards helping people, not in the least, but what I found in my exploration of this area was that not only did most people spend their time fighting over issues that were, for all purposes, irresolvable, but they also scarcely had any idea of what is really supposed to be done to change the world at all. I feel like, in a way, it's almost unfortunate that we vote at all, because all that really seems to serve is giving the people an outlet so they don't feel compelled to go further than that. Not that I believe voting is bad, quite the contrary. I think we need a great deal more of it. Everyone seems to think that the only thing that matters in politics is what your opinions are, but in truth, a politic which does not change your personal way of interacting with the world is not politics at all, but idealism entertainment. We are essentially like tourists of ideology, not the inhabitants of a changing world. I feel what has happened today is that many people are essentially losing their capability to employ critical thought in the face of hive minds of political socialization. And this is extremely problematic, because if we don't evaluate the depth of the nature of what and why we believe these things and simply derive our thoughts from people around us, what's likely to happen is empathy will eventually die out, because in my opinion, groups in human society are not yet truly capable of extending empathy towards others, and the reason for this is that we've been taught to bond in a certain way according to our own self-centered mindsets, and for the longest time we've been socially conditioned to view anyone who is an outsider, whether this is in the sense racial, nationalistic, or that of the modern political tribalism, as being a kind of existential threat to our own given group. And this is just how civilization has evolved, through the competing groups of stratified cultures with a group identity. The problem we face today, which I somewhat outlined in this past video, is that we are now at a point where there actually is no functional way to reconcile opposed groups with each other in a peaceful and functioning society. So the natural result of this is going to, unfortunately, be an endless war of attrition in politics. Now, this isn't as bad as people do eventually settle into new traditions and societal arrangements, regardless of how much we hold innate disagreements. Obviously, society has grown through compromise for a long time now. But to me, there is a complex problem afoot in the wake of a more global society, whereby there are only so many compromises that we can make until it turns into something resembling actual warfare. One of the tactics of warfare is and always has been deceit. What I want to do here is cut with a clear knife all the smog of falsehood and create a viable and balanced frameworks through which we can view and understand not only our own beliefs, but how our personal beliefs line up against other people's. I hope that this can make it so at a social level it's easier to understand where compromises need to be made, and also the exact way in which we can map out the way in which we develop systemic understandings collectively. Because if we're all looking at different maps when we're trying to figure out where we're headed, that will inevitably create unnecessary conflict, where two factions who may even be trying to go to the same destination don't even see eye to eye on the means with which to get to their final ideas of what society ought to look like. It's important that we learn to drop the narrative structure we've developed in our heads and engage with the real world, asking real questions for a change that is not too abstract or theoretical. To do that, I believe we should focus on making a practical model of what we believe society needs to look like, and find ways to move forward with that vision instead of bickering over details. Because what even is the point of our arguments if they don't manifest into anything in the real world? So can we do this and actually define the problem that's present instead of fighting over abstract moral concepts? Okay, great. Let me just read a quote from someone now who has dealt with a lot more than Let me just now read a quote from someone who has dealt with more than a fair share of political drama online. "I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting because it doesn't tell me anything about you. I can replace you with someone else that thinks the same way. And that means you're not here. It's not pleasant. You're not integrating the specifics of your personal experience with what you've been taught to synthesize something that's genuine and surprising, and engaging in a narrative sense as a consequence. And that's the pathology of ideological possession." That was Jordan Peterson. Now then, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this video. The USA is right here, give or take a little bit. Why isn't the USA in the blue quadrant? Why isn't it fascist? I mean, it's odd to me to even consider the kind of schizophrenic justifications that would go on to imagine that we have America, home of the free, and then being in the authoritative quadrant. But for the sake of argument, let's suppose that they were as high up in this chart as typically claimed. Couldn't someone just, run for office and do whatever they wanted with that power? I mean, we think of the government as this entity which exists in the nether realm somewhere, but there really isn't a very high bar for acquiring political power other than having more money than your opponent, really. Here's a fun fact. Did you know that in 90% of all, and I mean all, of US elections, the winning candidate spent more on their campaign? Think about that for a second. Corporations hold most of the power, the way I see it. Heck, they probably buy their own politicians at this point. And at least theoretically, corporations represent a form of decentralized power, though the lines do blur here and there. The real world isn't always simple enough to compress into a chart. To a very large extent, the government itself is just a corporatist central authority, with the only real motivator of the US government being profit margins at the end of the day. Whether they are waging war on foreigners or telling their own people to shut the hell up and consume happily, it's true that in general, corporations constrict the will of the people, but it is still true essentially that corporations are made up by and through the people. There are no slave masters or no limitations as of yet that prevent one from achieving the same level of wealth as Elon Musk if they were to actually self-generate that wealth. Heck, they could make rules to set all of us free if they were nice. CEOs and politicians are still different in the way they exert their power. To the current American system, which I did classify as anarcho-capitalism, we aren't important as autonomous people, except to what end we comply as being cash cows for the corporatocracy. I don't think the USA actually cares about any amount of control they exhibit over foreign powers, save for what they can actually do to ultimately extract more money from the world. If the US government were actually in the blue section, they would have some kind of grand plan or desire for authority's sake, and I just don't really think that's true. The United States is, as George Carlin put it, one giant shopping mall. I think whatever perceptions we have around ourselves as not being anarcho-capitalist are born more out of kind of politicized narcissism and catastrophization of the reason which truly underlies how politics unfold, where we delusionally believe our votes and beliefs are more important to the system's functionality than they actually are. And in a very basic sense, just think about American culture for a second. Like, do you really think at the end of the day Americans care more about controlling each other than making money? Not a chance. This could certainly change in the future, but ultimately, that's my opinion, and if you don't like it, well, people do kind of, for some reason, view anarcho-capitalism as some kind of Mad Max pure chaos world, though it's really just as delusional as believing that anarchism has an absence of any government. You might notice something awfully peculiar in this section, by the way, if you have at least a peripheral understanding of politics. Libertarians are leftist. Not what you typically expect, but yes, I do think that's the case. It's perhaps harder to spot for two principal reasons, that being that the history of leftist politics has been constrained to, as I mentioned before, two particularly hierarchical cases, Russia and China, and also that it's not quite as left-leaning as the two most primary aspects of leftist politics, which would be anarchism and communism. In essence, Libertarians believe that taxation without representation is a form of exploitation, which is true, and just generally hold beliefs that while working within a system that doesn't work directly to help people, it very literally liberates people to explore the world and their potential to the highest degree. Leftism doesn't have to be such rudimentary concepts as mere wealth redistribution. It really can just be about eliminating things that are against freedom as opposed to building things that are for freedom of people. I mean, it's really what these two polarities are about, if you think about it. The bottom half would basically be people can do whatever they want. We're not going to place limitations on behavior. Well, the top is more about a kind of ordered and calibrated social construct where everyone is working in tandem for clearly defined goals. It's basically the difference between the most common concept of leftist dictate in this market socialism sense and the libertarian, which again are both just as leftist as one another in my opinion. The difference between the anarchist and libertarian ideologies would therefore be that libertarians believe in majority rule as well, but in a less cohesively grouped way, whereby the majority just kind of acts through a very, laissez-faire kind of process, which is a tendency borrowed from capitalism. Now, I know right-wingers believe they have some kind of dictation over the concept of freedom, but there's a very simple distinction here. I think on the surface, any right-wing libertarian would agree with this premise, which is that you, as a libertarian, not only believe in freedom as something to be acquired, but freedom as a fundamental human right. You don't just think you should have freedom, you think everyone else should as well. And because of that, you actually fall into the category of the egalitarian left wing. So, let's talk about Stalin now. Here's my thing about Stalin. It's important to remember that Russia and all that it did basically was doing for its own development, which they have the right to. The US just happens to be so narcissistic that they project all that Russia has ever done as a kind of personal affront, which is ridiculous. In fact, Stalin was pretty much universally beloved by the Russian people and still is to this day. Okay, so why am I talking about this? Because the basis for communism is that of an authoritarian, egalitarian basis. And the power communist political figures hold has to be universally derived from and by the majority of the society's wishes. Stalin wouldn't be a leftist if he didn't work for the people under him. Unlike certain people, I don't really believe in this libertarian socialism, and I honestly think a lot of the discourse around what communism versus socialism versus anarchism has been kind of poisoned into obscurity, which, to be frank, is just a massive cope from the fact that, yeah, it actually is possible that a leftist government could be tyrannical. It happened. Literally anything on this chart could be tyrannical in the wrong hands, honest. To better explain my general perspective, I want to go into the initial reason that I rotated the chart at all. Like I said, one of the worst assumptions ever to come out of politics is that the left is about government and the right is about markets. You can see this very directly expressed in the quiz determining your own position on the compass. The only reason that people have made this connection between leftism and the government is because of the historical premise, which was created by the likes of the USSR and China's Great Leap Forward, where the governments at the time essentially took the idea of human rights, threw it out the window in favor of an intense period of industrialization. The reason they did this is more or less evident in the current geopolitical landscape, where both China and Russia are, in fact, major players, whereas before their own respective leftist movements, these countries were at an almost insignificant stage of development. I'm not trying to say at all that this wasn't real communism. However, just because this is the history of leftism does not mean that it's anything inherent to leftist politics. Whether it's anarchism or communism, you can't have a left-wing system without a priority on serving the highest number of people possible. And this can indeed come from more authoritative aspects, which would be outlined in the top left of the chart, but that's dismissing an entire half of the way that politics can operate. There's also anarchism, which is not when the government doesn't do stuff, it's when the government exists by and for the people, basically. And it's very closely related, in a great deal of oversimplification, to the premise of majority rule. It has the same operative principles of communism in essence, which is to serve the community through the community rather than pay most respect to the individual, but it does so in a way which is less centralized and more subject to the will of the people directly. And the effectual route to what you would call communism could actually be built out of this very grassroots organization coming out of anarchist principles. Personally, I do think you need a structured government, global or otherwise, to have what I would define as communism as separate from anarchism. But let's not get too pedantic here. I'm going to borrow a premise on the right wing to actually better explain this. So you can see here populism as contrasted to dictatorship. Both of them essentially do the same thing, which is enact people to themselves direct the means of societal recourse through fascistic means. But while the dictatorship premise is more of an imposition of that individual's authority, divine right of kings, if you will, the populism premise is more of creating a kind of cult of personality, whereby people actively submit their own will as in service to the populist icon, which is to say they are an authoritarian figure by way of democratic support, which comes from the bottom half's influence. You can see this pretty clearly defined by the worship of someone like Trump, but I think Elon is the better figure for the times to represent the chart here. Trump is, as I talked about here, little more than a clown in wolf's clothing. So in anarchism, you can really see the same thing happening at its core in contrast to communism. They are both just as much on the left as each other, but the means through which they realize their own action potential is different. So you may be asking yourself at this point, why did I choose Joe Rogan to be the figure of anarchism? Well, if you just look at it outside of the cultural fisheye lens for a moment, the dude just kind of speaks anarchist to me by his very nature. He doesn't really have a particular agenda. He basically just wants to find the ideas that would have popular support and have a guiding principle of aiding the greatest number of people possible. And he doesn't really discriminate based on like left-right ideology, but he's doing this through a kind of like grassroots means, really. So I really think what he's kind of doing here is a populist kind of leftism. I mean, it's not necessarily liberal or conservative, but to me, it's structurally leftist. He's not really an elitist kind of person. He definitely thinks the current system is flawed, and he even said he would vote for Bernie Sanders. So to clarify the idea, just think of an anarchist as someone who wants to build society using the people as a vehicle for mutual societal development. So let's talk about the top part of the chart, because this is the area that I think is actually most confusing, being that Americans kind of have this thing going where they like to make up fairy tales about the way in which their international enemies work. Like China, is China even communist? No, China is not communist. They are literally capitalist. State capitalist, yes, but not communist. Probably not even by their own definition. Though politically, they are quite different from us. They don't really have a radically different economic formation than we do. People work, live, and die just the same there as here, except their government plays a much more active role in determining the movements of society. I mean, we certainly have a government, but our government is pretty limp-wristed compared to Chinese government. But in terms of economic system, there's still business owners, and the people don't have direct control over the government either. So, and yes, China is indeed operated by the Communist Party of China, but they do not at all operate within a communist system. In fact, I wouldn't even say that they're even a leftist system. I'd put them right about here, just marginally more left of the US due to like social infrastructure, welfare, and stuff. But the key difference between this system and anarcho-capitalism is, as most people already know, the existence of the lack thereof of a free market structure. Both state and anarcho-capitalism are just as capitalist as each other, but they're both playing with the same rules of a capitalist society. So let's say China wanted to become more left-wing. I think you would have to begin having a lot more community input into what the government should be doing for them. A lot of things could basically stay the same in terms of, the effectual result, but if there was, say, a social credit system that would reward or punish people, it would be something that would actually be decided upon by the group based upon their values, rather than being put into this compelled system that is in service more to, the Chinese state as a whole than to, each other. I mean, that's the complaint with leftism generally, is that, they're going to tell you how to live your life, but that's not leftism. That's the centralized authority part. So yeah, the left side of this diametry between state capitalism and market socialism would be more focused on collective values. I mean, I don't want to harp on about this too much, but did you notice that I placed Jesus on literally the exact opposite of the system that we have today? He said, you know what Jesus said? He said, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. This is the most socialist thing anyone could ever say. Care for the needs of others just as you would me. Are you kidding me? These are the same people who condone mass corporate profits in a world where we can literally end world hunger right now if we wanted to. I mean, get out of here. Jesus was probably the most socialist person to ever exist. They nailed him to a cross next to two thieves, and he told them that they were going to heaven too. And then today you've got homeless people being thrown in jail just for being homeless. It's nonsense. And anyone who thinks Jesus wasn't socialist is speaking nonsense, okay? Just... So, market socialism. The way I'm interpreting here is kind of a socialist state where the power is fed to the people through a top-down process. Basically, the government saying, you will have workers' council, you will have a co-op business model, you will have a fair say in the economic movements of society, you will have a minimum standard of living, and so on. The way that this differs itself from the next portion down, communism, is not terribly great. The primary difference is that in order to get to this point, it would involve more people like actively rising up and then, making the necessary demands and restructuring society from a more grassroots level to get to that point, rather than the government structuring it for them, at a top-down level. That's the only real difference here. On the other hand, you have none other than Satan himself, Ronald Reagan, totally authoritarian with qualities of the right. You don't even want to know the stuff this guy did, but he is essentially to blame for the American state becoming what it is today, just totally hell-bent on world domination without any concept of compromise or cooperation. I should clarify something here. Politics and government are not identical. On one hand, you have the political system of the United States, which works to basically meet the needs of the people, lay out the law, etc. But there's also the matter of the U.S. government as it exists in the world stage, which is radically different. I'm extremely biased about this topic, so I'm not going to delve too far into it and just summarize by saying that no empire in the world has even come close to the amount of raw influence the American government has over all lesser powers. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that the United States government is, with few exceptions, the world government, which is something you would certainly see the libertarians being at the polar opposite side of opposing. And I definitely think, particularly today, that's a pretty valid position, personally. Fun fact, libertarian was originally used as a term to give a broad label to people who were socialists, anarchists, and communists alike, but it had its meaning co-opted by the likes of an anarcho-capitalist Murray Rothbard in a very much intentional effort to appropriate leftist ideals with capitalist thought. So the chart as a whole is just meant to give some meaning to my own political philosophy, which is kind of like more intent on gradual shifts than the kind of quantum leaps that you expect most people to see out of politics, which I don't think are feasible or even desirable if we're going to take a more conscious approach to politics. Each one of these systems, as I outline, has a relational correspondence with the systems which are next to it, and they can follow a logical progression as the society itself progresses. So I'll say again, I do want us to move towards a more collectivized society, more leftist, but the way in which we accomplish this should not assume the ends, but rather like focus on the process itself of transforming. So everyone feels like the world we're cultivating is one of freedom rather than this endless competition to get both people and society to fit in these boxes of what we need them to be. I just think a lot is lost in trying to force the changes we want versus collaborating for what we want, and for society to also hopefully reflect that in our attitudes when we're having these discussions. I've made a lot of claims in this video, though they may be fairly broad and honestly not as completely concrete as I may want to believe they are. For the purposes of this chart, they do serve their basic functionality, and if anyone wants to challenge me on some of these ideas, well, I'd question their ingenuity personally, because I'm going to say it again, politics isn't supposed to be complicated. Politics is just a particular wavelength people tune into, and if that works for a time, then that's great. I'm not trying to say I believe that all ideologies are made equally, but hey, if you feel like that's what I did here, I'd call the video a success. I'm trying to be unbiased, after all. There's probably more things I could have gone over here, honestly, but I feel like going on and on is kind of defeating the point of this video, which isn't meant to be an FAQ, just kind of a guide on how and why I came to these conclusions so that the main ideas make sense. I want it to be fairly simple. But yeah, if you're someone who doesn't know much of anything about politics, I'd be very glad if this video has taught you anything, and even if you believe that everything I said is wrong, at least you can see the way I look at it. So that's the extent of what I'm going to be talking about here, but if you like, I apparently have a subreddit that exists, sort of. I'll be posting this video on there and answering any questions you may have or giving any further explanations you may desire. I am a very online individual and will be answering every single question in the thread, so link is going to be in the description.